Okay, so here are our learning objectives, and circled the ones we're going to focus on. We're actually going to start with the one at the bottom, which is looking at the structure of chloroplasts first of all, and then we're going to look at the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis, including how light energy is trapped by exciting electrons in chlorophyll, and the role of these electrons in generating ATP, reducing NADP in photophosphorylation, and producing oxygen through photolysis of water. Now, we have actually talked about just about all those things anyway, but we're going to do it in a bit more detail. Right, okay, we'll move on. There's a little, I came across this, and I couldn't actually, I have to go to YouTube to watch this, but I thought this is quite good. It's an animation, but it's there's no sound, but they do, you can read it. Right, okay, we'll play this again. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's some music. Can you hear the music?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So it is actually a scientific animation. So they're trying to reproduce what goes on. And I might provide a bit of narration, but they are actually telling you what's going on. So only lasts a few minutes. So we're going to perhaps pop through a stomata in a minute. Yep. Now in the spongy mesophyll, there's lots of air spaces. The palisade cells are heading up towards those. So this causes the root CO2 to follow the stomata and then diffusing up into the palisade mesophyll cells. Cell structure there, body's endoplasmic reticulum. Membranes the nucleus, the purple blobs, the mitochondria. Green things. And the cells have a skeleton. I don't know if you're aware of this actually. Microfilaments and microtubules which move things around as well. Right, so we're inside the chloroplast now. These pancake things are called the thylakoid membranes, and the stuff outside that is called the stroma. We have diagrams for this. And a lot of the light reaction takes place on the surface of these membranes here. So it gives a photosystem, these clusters of photons, which all contain the chlorophyll. Photosystem is a cluster of molecules that contain chlorophyll. And yeah, the rotating is the enzyme that makes ATP. So this is about it. See, the little squiggling things are ATP molecules. Right, so let's start with chloroplast then. All of photosynthesis, both the light and the light dependent and the independent reaction, happen in chloroplasts. Not all plant cells have them. So what sort of cells wouldn't have chloroplasts?
Root hair cells.
Yeah, root cells, because they get no light. There's no point in having chloroplasts. So anything that's not green hasn't got it. But the stem, the outside of the stem, they have them, and the leaves. And so the ones that have most are the palisade mesophyll cells at the top of the leaf. That is, if I'm just going to change my pointer. Here we go. So these are the palisade cells here. Okay, and you can see they're chock full of chloroplasts. If you look at the epidermis cells at the top, you'll see that they haven't got any or very few. Right, chloroplasts also have their own DNA because they originated from independent cells which got taken up by an archaean cell. But interestingly, some of the chloroplast DNA has been taken into the cell nucleus and is now part of the cell's DNA. that makes some of the proteins that are necessary for the chloroplast to function. So chloroplasts would not be able to function independently any longer. They have a double membrane, just as mitochondria do. And a double membrane is called an envelope. So if you ever see the term an envelope, a nuclear envelope means it's a double membrane. Right, and the membranes inside are called thylakoid membranes. That's usually worth a mark some point in the exams. And they form sacs in which the light-dependent reaction happens. Outside of those thylakoids is the material which is called a stroma, and that's like a liquid basically which fills them. The stroma is where the light-independent reactions happen. So those terms, thylakoid membranes, stroma, those are important. This is the diagram from your book, which has quite a bit of information there. I'm not going to read through it now, but again, all of those terms you really should need. The other thing there is the granum, which is a stack of those sacs of thylakoid membranes. So the one reaction, the light reaction, happens on the membranes, the thylakoid membranes. The light independent happens in the stroma. There's just one more here. I thought that, because this shows also you have things like starch granules. So some of the sugar, some of the glucose made by photosynthesis will be turned into starch, and you will find starch granules inside the chloroplast. I don't think there's anything particularly of interest there. Plastoglobulus, I had to look that up. It just means a large molecule. So you don't need to know that. Right, again, this is the quick memory test here. Anybody like to suggest what number 1 is?
Membrane?
Yeah, that's the membrane. Actually, they say the outer membrane, but it's difficult to tell. It's just that. What about number 2? Somebody have a guess? It's not a nucleus because they don't have nuclei. It was on the previous slide.
Is it a granum?
No, the grana of that's coming up. That's a starch grain, okay? And 3 is the granum, because if you look, you can see, if you look along here, there's a stack of those membranes, okay? There's another granum here, another big one here, little one there, and so on. So 4 is the stroma. It is quite difficult to see on this. So that's just like the space outside the membranes, and 5 would just be a thylakoid membrane. Okay, so that's the structure of the chloroplast.
Wait, so are thylakoid membranes like the inner membrane?
Sorry, are they? I think they're separate. They don't. I think they're separate from the inner membrane. It's not like mitochondria where the foldings are made from it. I'm not absolutely sure. It may be that they're continuous with it, but they are. All of those membranes, most of what you see inside the chloroplast is thylakoid membranes, and some of them are stacked together to form granum, and some of them are just kind of individual membranes. So they're all kind of interconnected.
Is it a bit like Golgi apparatus?
Yeah, it is a bit like that actually. Yes, but they're closer together. The Golgi, I think they're kind of close but not touching. Okay. Right, so that's the structure of the chloroplasts. So let's actually have a look at again, I told you I keep banging on about energy, and I will do. So energy, actually, it's not quite as simple as being just turned from light energy into chemical energy and glucose. What actually happens, the first transition, the light is converted into energy in electrons. You probably know, if you do chemistry, you'll probably know this, but if you only did GCSE chemistry, you might not know. But when you shine, well, you probably don't do physics actually, when you shine light on substances, the electrons absorb that energy and they're boosted to a higher energy level. and then they drop back down to their original energy level, and they emit that energy as light. And that's why we get absorption spectrum and emission spectrum from when light passes through gas, for example. That's how neon lights work, that they absorb the electrical energy and then they emit it as light energy. Now here, chlorophyll is different because chlorophyll doesn't emit, it absorbs the light energy, but it doesn't then re-emit it as light. What happens, the energy is taken up by the electrons and held by those electrons, and they then move down the electron transport chain, and they give that energy up in that way rather than emitting it as light. That energy is then used by the electron transport chain to make ATP. So go back again, so to the start, light energy hits chlorophyll and you get excited electrons, so in a higher energy level. Those electrons then move down this is the second arrow, they move down the electron transport chain, and their energy is given up to ATP. So the energy now is in ATP. And then the third arrow, that ATP goes off to the light independent reactions to build up glucose. So the first two transitions happen in the light dependent bit. The third one is the light independent bit. Okay. Right, so this is similar to one we looked at last week. Again, this is a summary of the chemical substances. So we have water goes into the chloroplast. Light energy is used to split water, and that produces three things: oxygen, which is given off as a waste product, hydrogen ions, and electrons. And the electrons, as we've said, they actually move down the electron transport chain, and their energy is put into ATP. So that little yellow stairway arrow, I've got a pointer there, that is the electron transport chain. The purpose of that is to take the energy from electrons and turn it into ATP. We then have NADP, which you'll remember, and NADP picks up the hydrogen ions and the electrons. It becomes reduced NADP. And that is the end of the light dependent reaction. We're going to look at it in a little bit more detail, but that's quite a useful summary, because there are two things that are input. We've got light going in and we've got water going in, and we've got three products. One is oxygen, one is ATP, and one is reduced NADP. I suppose you could say the things going in are NADP and ADP, because they have to get turned into ATP and reduced NADP. But simplification. Is everybody okay with that so far? Any questions? Okay. Right. This is now we're getting into the real detail. This is the most detail we will do at the moment. What we're looking at here is, again, this is in your book, this diagram. The thylakoid membrane here is in the middle of the screen, and that has a series of molecules embedded in it. And the reason this has to happen on the membrane is because you need these molecules in a particular sequence. But there's a lot going on there, so I'm just going to focus on one bit at a time. And so, why is that not working? Oh, there we go. Right. So I'm going to start. There are two of these things called photosystems, and in previous years, people tend to get a bit hung up on photosystems. I would say you probably won't even need to talk about them. But essentially, they're just a clump of molecules together, some of which are chlorophyll. So it's chlorophyll and other stuff. But it's more important about what they do. So energy from sunlight hits the chlorophyll and is absorbed. What happens next? That energy is transferred to electrons, which are excited to a higher energy level. The next bit, those electrons pass along a series of electron carrier molecules embedded in the membrane. That is the electron transport chain. So the electrons are literally passed from one to the other. And as we said last time, because remember oil rig, because you're moving electrons, you are talking about oxidation and reduction reactions. So each one of those carrier molecules is being reduced when it gains electrons, and then it's oxidized when it loses them. The next step, sorry, did somebody want to say something? No. Next step is the what's happened. The chlorophyll molecule in PS1 has lost electrons. So the electrons from PS2, a similar thing happens. They're excited by light, and they pass down electron transport chain. The energy they use is used to build up. Come on. Is this not? Oh, sorry. I've gone. Let me get back one. So a similar thing. Photosystem 2 absorbs energy. Electrons excited, pass down an electron transport chain. The energy this time there is used to build up. At the top is used to build up ATP. Okay. And finally, the electrons from PS2 replace the electrons lost from PS1. But now we still have the problem that PS2 has lost electrons. So we have to replace those. And this is where water comes in. So an enzyme catalyzes the splitting of water to give oxygen, hydrogen ions, and electrons. And this is what we call photolysis. Okay, and those electrons then go back to PS2 and replace the electrons lost from the chlorophyll there. If you didn't do that, that chlorophyll would have a positive charge, having lost electrons, and it would be much harder for future electrons to leave it because they're negative, so they'd be attracted to it. So in order to keep it going, so the role of water here is really to do two things. It replaces the electrons that are lost from chlorophyll, and it supplies hydrogen, which is used to reduce carbon dioxide in the light independent reaction. Okay, and then finally, the last bit, there's our NADP carrier molecule, which picks up the hydrogen ions and the electrons which have come from PS1, and it becomes reduced NADP and trots off to the stroma. Right, I realise there is quite a lot going on there. So have a look at it in the book. Have a look at the PowerPoint as well, if that helps. This is another representation of what's going on here. So we're starting here with PS2, absorbing light. Any electrons are excited. They move down the electron transport chain here, and ADP, an inorganic phosphate, is built up into ATP. The electrons end up in PS1. Electrons there are excited by light. They move down the electron transport chain and are taken up by NADP with hydrogen ions, and that produces reduced NADP. Water down at the bottom, oxygen's given off, the electrons replace those from PS2. One more thing I want to say here, this production of ATP here is called photophosphorylation. Photo because it needs light, phosphorylation because you're adding phosphate to ADP, okay? And they do like to talk about photophosphorylation. We will, when we do respiration, we're going to look at more about how this process happens, how the electron transport chain builds up ATP, but we're not going to deal with it now. Right. So, summary of what we've just done in words. So no pictures on this one, but this is just describing in words. So light energy from the sun excites chlorophyll. High energy electrons leave and pass along a series of carrier proteins. The ionized chlorophyll causes the breakup of water. So it's not light. I mean, it's obvious if you think about it. Water doesn't disintegrate into hydrogen and oxygen when you shine sunlight on it. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any oceans. It takes the presence of enzymes and the chlorophyll molecule to absorb the electrons from it. The electrons from the water replace the ones lost from chlorophyll, and you're producing hydrogen ions and oxygen. So it's actually becoming more acidic because you're producing hydrogen ions, but those are being taken away as well. ATP is formed as an inorganic phosphate group is added to ADP, using from the energy from the high energy electrons from PS2. Right, this bit we covered last time, didn't we, about ATP? So I'm not going to go over that again. That's just simply the ATP structure, and that one we did as well. So at this point, at the end of the light reaction, we've produced reduced NADP, which has hydrogen and electrons, and we have ATP, and that is all that's needed from the light reaction. They go into the light independent reaction along with CO2 and produce glucose, but that's another story. So just to go back, so just 5.7, understand the light dependent reactions, including how light energy is trapped by exciting electrons in chlorophyll, the role of electrons generating ATP and reducing NADP and producing oxygen. Okay, I know there is a lot to take in there, and I don't expect people to retain all that instantly. There's another little animation here I'd like to play. This is about 4 minutes, and I think I'm going to stop it at the end of the light reaction, and we'll watch the whole of it after we've done the next bit. Okay, hopefully this will play.
In order for plants to grow, they need
See in
inputs of
here?
carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources to manufacture glucose, the building blocks of plants, is called photosynthesis. In the process, oxygen gas is produced as a byproduct. The energy for photosynthesis originates in the sun and arrives at the earth as sunlight. This light has both a wave and a particle nature. The particles, or photons, are the smallest units of light. Photons oscillate along a path, which is measured as wavelengths. The light emitted from the sun contains photons in a wide spectrum of wavelengths, called the electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthetic organisms use only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, called visible light. Photosynthetic organisms contain pigments that facilitate the capture of wavelengths of light in the visible light range. The color of the pigment comes from the wavelengths of light reflected. Plants appear green because they reflect yellow and green wavelengths of light. Red and blue wavelengths of light are absorbed by these pigments and provide the energy that is used for photosynthesis. Photosynthetic organisms, also as autotrophs, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis occur within plant cells in specialized structures known as chloroplasts. Photosynthesis consists of two sets of reactions, the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. Within the chloroplast are small disc-like structures called thylakoids, which are surrounded by a fluid-filled space called the stroma. The reactions that synthesize glucose, the Calvin cycle, occur in the stroma. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. It is here that conversion of light energy to chemical energy is initiated. In most photosynthetic organisms, thylakoids contain pairs of photosystems, called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, that work in tandem to produce the energy that will later be used in the stroma to manufacture sugars. The photosystems of the thylakoid consist of a network of accessory pigment molecules and chlorophyll, the molecules that absorb the photons of light. Within the pigment molecules, the absorbed light energy excites electrons to a higher state. Photosystems will channel the excitation energy gathered by the pigment molecules to a reaction center chlorophyll molecule, which will then pass the electrons to a series of proteins located on the thylakoid membrane. Photons of light strike photosystems 1 and 2 simultaneously. We will examine what happens with the photons striking photosystem 2 first. The energized electrons are passed from the reaction center of photosystem 2 to an electron transport chain. The electrons lost by photosystem 2 are replaced by a process called photolysis, which involves the oxidation of a water molecule producing free electrons and oxygen gas. While this oxygen gas is a byproduct of photosynthesis, it is an important input to the cellular respiration pathways. As electrons pass through the electron transport chain, the energy from the electron is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma to the thylakoid, creating a concentration gradient. This gradient powers a protein called ATP synthase, which phosphorylates ADP to form ATP. Electrons leaving photosystem 2 are shuttled to photosystem 1. Within photosystem 1, low-energy electrons are re-energized and are passed through an electron transport chain where they are used to reduce the electron carrier NADP+ to NADPH. When the chloroplast is receiving a steady supply of photons, NADPH and ATP molecules are rapidly being provided to the metabolic pathways in the stroma.